Emily adjusted her dress in the mirror, smoothing out the fabric as she checked her reflection one last time. The deep blue silk complemented her complexion, and she had taken extra care with her hair and makeup, though she told herself it was just because Jake's boss was coming over. It was not often that they had important guests at the house, and she wanted to make a good impression. Jake stood in the doorway, rolling his sleeves up as he glanced at her. "You look great," he said, offering a quick smile before turning toward the dining table. He had been preoccupied all afternoon, ensuring everything was perfect for Richard Sterling's visit. Emily nodded, though she barely acknowledged his compliment. "Are you nervous?" "Not nervous," Jake replied, adjusting the wine glasses. "Just want everything to go smoothly. Richard isn't just any boss. He holds people's futures in his hands." Emily had heard about Richard countless times, how powerful he was, how well respected. But until tonight, he had been just a name, a figure Jake admired from a distance. She had imagined an older man with greying hair, serious and imposing. When the doorbell rang, Jake exhaled sharply, smoothing his tie before heading to the door. Emily followed, standing slightly behind as he pulled it open. Richard Sterling stepped inside with a confident stride, his presence commanding without effort. He was tall, his dark suit fitted perfectly, and his salt and pepper hair only enhanced his striking appearance. His sharp, assessing eyes landed on Emily almost immediately, and when he smiled, it was with a charm that felt both effortless and deliberate. Jake extended his hand. "Richard, thanks for coming." Richard shook Jake's hand firmly before turning his attention to Emily. "And this must be the lovely wife I've heard so much about." Emily felt a strange flutter in her stomach as Richard reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips instead of shaking it. His touch was warm, his grip confident. She told herself it was just politeness, nothing more. But the way his eyes lingered on her, the way his lips barely brushed her skin, sent an unexpected thrill down her spine. "You've got a beautiful home," Richard remarked as he stepped inside, "and an even more beautiful hostess." Emily felt the heat rise to her cheeks, but managed a polite smile. "Thank you. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." Jake, oblivious to the exchange, led Richard toward the dining room, eager to begin their carefully planned dinner. Emily followed, trying to shake the strange sensation lingering from that brief interaction. As the evening progressed, Richard's charm filled the space effortlessly. He was articulate, engaging, and undeniably charismatic. Unlike Jake, who seemed eager to impress, Richard carried himself with an air of ease, as though he was always in control of the room. Emily found herself drawn into the conversation more than she expected. Richard asked about her work, her interests, making her feel as though her thoughts truly mattered. His attention never wavered, his eyes locking onto hers as he listened intently. "You must keep things interesting with a wife, as intelligent as she is beautiful," Richard commented, swirling the wine in his glass as he looked at Jake. Jake chuckled, taking the compliment at face value. "She's amazing, I'm lucky." Emily smiled, but she noticed how Richard's gaze did not shift away from her. There was something lingering there, something unreadable, yet undeniably intense. As the night continued, the subtle moments between them became harder to ignore. When she reached for the breadbasket, Richard's hand lightly brushed hers, the contact lingering just a second longer than necessary. When she laughed at a joke he made, he leaned in slightly, his voice lower, his attention solely on her. Jake, ever focused on discussing work and making a strong impression, remained unaware of the tension beginning to build. At one point, Emily excused herself to the kitchen to check on dessert. As she moved toward the counter, she heard footsteps behind her. "Need any help?" She turned to find Richard standing in the doorway, watching her with that same intense gaze. She smiled, keeping her tone light. "I think I can handle plating a few slices of cake." Richard stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. "You have a way of making even simple tasks look elegant." Emily swallowed, the space between them suddenly feeling smaller. "That's very kind of you to say." His eyes never left hers. "It's not kindness, just honesty." For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, as though someone was noticing the details Jake had long since overlooked. The way Richard looked at her made her feel desirable, important. She told herself it was just the wine, just harmless conversation. But when Richard reached past her, his fingers barely grazing her wrist as he picked up a plate, she felt her pulse quicken. "You've built a lovely home here," he said, his voice smoother now, "but I can't help but wonder, does it ever feel like something is missing?" The question lingered between them. Emily opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, Jake called from the dining room, "Emily, everything all right?" She stepped back, as if suddenly realizing how close Richard had gotten. "Yes, just bringing dessert now." Richard smiled, picking up a plate and handing it to her. "Then I suppose we'll have to continue our conversation another time." She nodded, not trusting herself to say more. As they returned to the dining table, Emily tried to refocus, to push aside whatever had just happened in the kitchen. But the way Richard watched her, the knowing smirk on his lips, told her that something had already begun. And despite every warning in her mind, she knew she was already too intrigued to walk away. Emily stared at the message on her phone, her heartbeat quickening. "Had a wonderful evening. Your presence made it even more enjoyable. Hope to see you again soon." "Oh, Richard." Her fingers hovered over the screen. A polite response was the right thing to do. She told herself it was just gratitude, nothing more. "Thank you, Richard. It was a pleasure hosting you." She locked her phone and set it down, but a strange warmth lingered in her chest. No man had made her feel that way in years. She told herself it was harmless, that she was simply flattered by the attention. Later that night, as she lay in bed beside Jake, she felt her phone vibrate again. Another message. "I'd love to continue our conversation. Maybe over coffee? No pressure, of course, just two people talking." Her breath caught as she read it. She knew what this was. A choice. A boundary she had never crossed before. A line she was either about to step over or ignore. She glanced at Jake, his breathing deep and steady as he slept. He had been so consumed by work that he hadn't noticed the growing distance between them. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe she just wanted someone to talk to. Her fingers moved on their own. "Coffee sounds nice." 2 days later, Emily walked into an upscale cafe downtown, her heart pounding in a way she hadn't felt in years. Richard was already there, seated at a corner table, watching her approach with that confident smirk. "Emily," he greeted smoothly, standing up as she reached him. He leaned in, placing a hand on the small of her back as he kissed her cheek. Her skin tingled under his touch. "I wasn't sure if I should come," she admitted as she sat across from him. "I hoped you would," he said, eyes locked on hers. "You're an intriguing woman." She let out a nervous laugh. "And what makes you say that?" "The way you carry yourself," Richard replied, stirring his coffee. "The way you light up a room without even realizing it. The way you think before you speak. It's rare." Emily felt warmth spread through her. Richard had a way of making her feel like she was the most important person in the room. They talked effortlessly. He asked about her ambitions, her interests, her passions, things Jake hadn't asked about in years. Hours slipped by as he listened with an intensity that made her feel truly seen. "I should go," she finally said, checking the time. Richard leaned forward, his gaze never wavering. "You don't have to." A flutter of something dangerous stirred in her chest. "I do," she said, standing up. He watched her closely, then reached for her hand. The touch was brief, but it lingered. "Then let me say this before you leave. This has nothing to do with Jake. I see you, Emily, and I think you see me too." Her breath caught, but she pulled her hand away. Without another word, she turned and walked out. But the moment she got into her car, her fingers trembled as she typed a message. "I see you too." The next time they met, it was not for coffee. Richard invited her to his office under the pretense of discussing Jake's career. She knew it was a lie. He knew it was a lie. But she went anyway. His office was sleek, modern, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. But it was Richard who commanded her attention. "You came," he said, standing as she walked in. "You asked me to." "And yet you hesitated," he said, watching her closely. She exhaled. "Because I know where this is going." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Then tell me to stop." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Richard reached up, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I think about you, Emily, more than I should." Her pulse quickened. "This is wrong." "Then walk away," he challenged. She should have. She knew she should have. But when his lips brushed against hers, she didn't pull away. She kissed him back. And in that moment, everything changed. The affair began with stolen moments, a lingering touch as he passed her, a whispered compliment that sent shivers down her spine, secret messages that made her pulse race. Then came the late-night meetings, hotel rooms booked under different names, excuses carefully crafted to avoid suspicion. Emily became someone she no longer recognized, reckless, daring, addicted to the thrill of secrecy. She told herself she had control, that she could stop whenever she wanted. But every time she tried to walk away, Richard pulled her back in. "You're intoxicating," he murmured one evening, pressing kisses down her neck. "I can't get enough of you." She knew this was dangerous. She knew if Jake ever found out, it would destroy everything. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Lying became second nature. She told Jake she had networking events, late meetings, errands that conveniently kept her out of the house for hours. At first he didn't question it. He had always trusted her. But as the affair continued, Emily felt his eyes linger on her longer. She noticed the way he hesitated before kissing her goodbye, the way he asked more questions than usual. She assured herself she was being careful, until the night everything almost fell apart. She and Richard had met at a secluded restaurant on the outskirts of town, where no one would recognize them. They sat in a dimly lit booth, her hand resting on his thigh as they spoke in hushed tones. Then her phone buzzed. "Jake, where are you?" Her stomach dropped. Richard watched her, his fingers grazing hers. "Problem?" She forced a smile. "Just Jake checking in." "You're shaking," he murmured, his lips brushing against her ear. "Does lying to him excite you?" A thrill of guilt and pleasure coursed through her veins. "I should go home," she whispered. But she didn't move. She stayed. And she knew in that moment there was no turning back. Emily checked her phone for the 10th time that evening, her hands trembling as she scrolled through Richard's messages. "Come see me, now." The demand was clear, no pleasantries, no softness. He had stopped asking weeks ago. "Now," he commanded. She glanced at Jake, who sat on the couch scrolling through his laptop. His shoulders were tense, his jaw clenched. He had been distant lately, watching her more closely. "I have to run out for a bit," she said, forcing her voice to stay even. Jake barely looked up. "Another late meeting?" Emily hesitated. The way he said it sent a chill through her. There was something in his tone, something different. "Yeah," she said quickly, grabbing her purse. "I won't be long." She hurried out before he could question her further, her pulse hammering in her chest. Richard's penthouse was dimly lit, the city skyline stretching out behind him as he poured himself a drink. "You're late," he said without looking at her. Emily exhaled, setting her bag down. "Jake's been acting strange. I had to be careful." Richard finally turned, his gaze sharp. "Careful?" He took a slow sip of his drink. "Do you think I care about your husband's suspicions?" She swallowed hard. "I just don't want him finding out." Richard set his glass down and stepped closer. "Maybe he should. Maybe it's time you stopped pretending." Emily tensed. "That's not what we agreed on." He smirked. "Things change." Something in his voice made her stomach twist. The thrill that had once consumed her was fading, replaced by something heavier. "You knew what this was," she said carefully. "I can't ruin my life for you." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "Your life?" He tilted his head. "Tell me, Emily, whose life do you think you're living now?" Her breath hitched as he pulled out his phone and scrolled through a set of images. Her, him, the hotel rooms, the stolen moments. "I own you now," he said smoothly. "You leave and these end up in Jake's inbox. Or worse, his boss's." Her knees went weak. "You wouldn't," Richard smiled. "Try me." Emily's hands shook. She had been a fool to think she had any control. She had walked into this with her eyes wide open, convinced she was making her own choices. But Richard had been pulling the strings all along. "What do you want?" she whispered. He leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. "You. When I want, where I want, no more excuses, no more hesitation." Tears burned at the edges of her vision. "You're blackmailing me?" Richard chuckled. "Call it what you want." She took a shaky step back. "This isn't love," he shrugged. "It doesn't have to be." Emily barely made it through the front door before she collapsed against the wall, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. Her phone buzzed again. "See you tomorrow. Don't keep me waiting." She felt sick. She didn't hear Jake enter the room until it was too late. "You're shaking." His voice was quiet, controlled. Emily forced a laugh, tucking her phone away. "It's just been a long day." Jake studied her, his eyes dark. "Where were you?" Her breath caught. "At the office. You know that?" "Really?" He tilted his head. "Because I called your office. You weren't there." Her blood ran cold. "You want to tell me where you really were?" She swallowed. "Jake, You're lying." His voice was steel now. "You've been lying for weeks." Emily's hands trembled as she reached for him. "Please, don't do this. Jake stepped back. "Who is he?" Her entire body went numb. Who is he, Emily?" His voice cracked, his anger barely contained. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Jake let out a bitter laugh. "It's Richard, isn't it?" Her stomach dropped. His hands curled into fists. "God, I was so blind." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Jake, please, stop," he snapped. "Just stop." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake exhaled shakily, rubbing his hands over his face. "I need you to tell me the truth. Right now." She hesitated, and that was all the confirmation he needed. His entire body stiffened. "How long?" Emily wiped her tears. "Jake, I never meant to." "How long, Emily?" His voice was raw, broken. She swallowed hard. "A few months." Jake's eyes darkened. "And I was just supposed to never find out?" "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered. He let out a bitter chuckle. "You didn't want to hurt me?" He stepped closer, shaking his head. "You didn't care about me at all." Emily's legs barely held her up. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" She was drowning, unable to find the right words. Jake exhaled, his jaw tight. "You let him touch you. You let him take everything we built and burn it to the ground." Tears fell freely down her face. I was lost. You were selfish. Emily let out a sob. I love you. Jake's expression hardened. No, you don't. She reached for him again, but this time he didn't move away. He just stood there, looking at her like he had never seen her before. I trusted you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I would have done anything for you. Emily sobbed harder. Please don't leave me. Jake closed his eyes for a long moment before opening them again, his decision clear. You left me first. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Emily standing in the wreckage of everything she had destroyed. Jake sat in his car, gripping his phone as he scrolled through the records. Call logs, hidden messages, GPS locations, everything was right there in front of him. He had spent the last few weeks piecing it all together, knowing something was wrong, feeling it in his gut every time Emily smiled at her phone or came home late. Now, there was no doubt. He tapped the screen, opening the security camera footage he had installed outside their house just days earlier. His hands tightened into fists as he watched Richard's car pull up while he was at work. He saw Emily open the door, her expression shifting into something soft, something Jake hadn't seen in years. He watched her step outside, scan the street, then pull Richard inside. His stomach turned. The betrayal was real, undeniable. Jake inhaled sharply, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. His mind raced, every moment from the past few months flashing before him. The late nights, the sudden changes, the lies. How long had she been doing this? How long had she been laughing behind his back while she let another man take what was supposed to be his? He clenched his jaw and made his decision. Emily adjusted her blouse in the mirror, smoothing down the fabric as she prepared to meet Richard at their usual spot. She had convinced herself that this affair wasn't hurting anyone, that Jake would never find out, that she was in control. Her phone buzzed. Richard. See you soon. Wear that red dress I like. She smiled, but before she could reply, she heard the front door open. Jake stepped inside, his face unreadable. You're home early, she said, keeping her voice light. He nodded, his eyes scanning her. Yeah, figured I'd take the afternoon off. Something in his tone made her shift uncomfortably. That's nice. He walked closer, placing his phone on the table between them. I found something interesting today. Her stomach dropped. She glanced at the phone, at the paused security footage on the screen, the still image of her and Richard at the front door, locked in a moment she could no longer deny. Her breath caught. Jake, I can explain. Don't. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of something dangerous. I want to hear the truth. Her hands trembled. It was a mistake. He let out a bitter laugh. A mistake? Emily, mistakes happen once. This question mark, this was a choice. Tears welled in her eyes. I never wanted to hurt you. He stared at her, his jaw tightening. But you did. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. How long? He asked. She swallowed hard. A few months. He shook his head, exhaling slowly. Why him? She hesitated. The truth was humiliating. Because he made me feel wanted. Jake's expression darkened. And I didn't? She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. His eyes burned with a mixture of anger and pain. You ruined us for this, for some attention, Emily sobbed. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. Jake's voice was like steel. But you let it happen. She reached for him, but he stepped back. Jake, please, I love you. He shook his head. No, you love the idea of what we had. But you didn't love me enough to stop yourself. Her whole body shook. I can fix this. I'll end it. Just give me a chance. He exhaled sharply. I'm not the one you need to worry about. Her brows furrowed. What do you mean? Jake leaned against the table, his voice calm but firm. You think Richard actually cares about you? You think he's going to protect you now that this is out in the open? She frowned. What are you talking about? Jake pulled out a folder and tossed it onto the table. I did my own research. Richard has a pattern, Emily. You're not the first wife he's done this with, and you won't be the last. Her heart pounded as she opened the folder. Inside were reports, screenshots, emails, women, several of them. Every single one of these women thought they were special, Jake continued. They all thought Richard was different. But when things got messy, he dropped them, and they lost everything. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages. Jake's voice turned cold. He's using you, and you're too blind to see it. Emily's breath hitched. Number he cares about me. Jake's laughter was sharp, bitter. You think so? Then let's find out. Before she could react, he picked up his phone and dialed Richard's number. Her eyes widened. Jake, don't... He pressed speakerphone. The line rang twice before Richard's voice came through. Emily, babe, I'm waiting. You on your way? Jake's expression didn't change. She's not coming. Silence. Then Richard's voice dropped. Jake. Yeah, Jake said. Surprised? A pause, then Richard chuckled. I assume Emily told you some sob story. Look, man, this isn't personal. Jake cut him off. It is now. Richard sighed. Look, I don't want problems. Let's be adults here. Jake smirked. Oh, we will be. Because here's the thing, I have evidence of everything. Your messages, your visits, your history with other women. Richard's tone darkened. You don't want to do this? Oh, I do, Jake said smoothly. Because I'm not just some fool you can play with. I sent this information to a few people, including your board of directors. Richard's voice sharpened. You have no idea what you're doing, Jake laughed. Actually, I do. I made sure this would hit the press first thing in the morning. Your career over, your reputation finished. Emily's breath caught. Jake. He ignored her, his focus locked on Richard. And if you ever contact Emily again, I'll make sure every single one of your skeletons comes out. Understood? Silence. Then Richard exhaled. Fine, she's yours. She was never that important anyway. The call ended. Emily gasped as if she had been slapped. Jake, what did you do? Jake's voice was ice. I ended it. Tears streamed down her face. I never wanted this. You didn't think, Emily. You didn't care. She reached for him again. Please, don't leave me. Jake studied her for a long moment. Then he grabbed his keys. You left me first, he said quietly before walking out the door. Emily stared at the divorce papers in front of her, her hands trembling as she gripped the pen. The words blurred together, her mind refusing to process the reality staring her in the face. Jake's signature was already there, neat and final. He had made his decision, and now all that was left was for her to accept it. Her lawyer sat across from her, watching her with a neutral expression. Emily, you need to sign. Her throat felt dry. He really wants this. The lawyer sighed. He's been clear about his decision. He's given you a fair settlement considering the circumstances, but his conditions are firm. No reconciliation, no second chances. Tears stung her eyes as she lowered her gaze to the paper. It was real. The life she had built, the years she had spent with Jake, gone. All because she had been foolish enough to believe Richard had been worth it. Her fingers tightened around the pen as she finally scrawled her name at the bottom of the document. With one stroke, it was over. The whispers started almost immediately. Emily walked into her office, clutching her purse, feeling the weight of every glance, every hushed conversation that stopped the moment she entered the room. People who had once greeted her with warm smiles now barely met her eyes. She sat at her desk, opening her laptop, but the tension was suffocating. It was only a matter of time before it became obvious. Minutes later, her boss's assistant approached. "Mr. Lawson wants to see you." Her stomach twisted as she stood and made her way to the office. When she entered, her boss sat behind his desk, his fingers laced together, his expression unreadable. "Close the door, Emily." She did. He exhaled. "You know why you're here?" She nodded, barely able to speak. He tapped a document on his desk. "Your involvement with Richard Sterling has put the company in a difficult position. We value professionalism here, and unfortunately, given the recent public nature of things, we can't afford to keep you on." Her breath hitched. "Please, I can fix this. I'll work harder." "It's not about your work," he cut in. "Your reputation now reflects on the company. We can't afford to have that." She felt the floor slipping beneath her. "I've given years to this firm, and you threw it all away for a man who isn't even sticking around." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I'm sorry, Emily," her boss said, sliding a folder toward her. "You have until the end of the day to clear out your desk." The phone calls stopped. Emily tried reaching out to friends, but one by one they distanced themselves. "I don't think it's a good time, Emily. Look, I don't want to get involved. I can't support what you did to Jake." Even her own family barely spoke to her. Her mother's voice was cold when she answered. "You made your choices, Emily," she said, "and now you're living with them." Emily tried to protest, but the call ended. She was alone. She sat in her apartment, not the house she once shared with Jake, because he had made sure that belonged to him now, staring at the empty space around her. Once, she had everything: a home, a husband who loved her, a career, friends. Now, all that remained was silence. Months passed. Jake moved on. She saw it in passing on social media, in whispered conversations from old acquaintances. "Did you see Jake? He looks incredible." "Yeah, he's been hitting the gym, traveling, just thriving." "Good for him. He deserves to be happy after what Emily put him through." Emily tried to avoid it, but one evening she saw him. She had stopped by a small cafe she used to visit with Jake, needing something familiar. And there he was. He stood by the counter, laughing, his entire demeanour lighter, stronger, happier. A woman stood beside him, smiling as she touched his arm. She was beautiful, confident, her energy effortless. Emily's heart clenched as she watched Jake lean in slightly, a genuine smile on his face, a smile he hadn't given her in years. She wanted to run, to turn away before he saw her, but then his gaze lifted. For a moment they locked eyes. Her breath caught. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without hesitation, he turned back to the woman in front of him and continued their conversation, like she was nothing, like she had never mattered. Emily stumbled out of the cafe, her hands shaking. The weight of her decisions crushed her. She had thought she was in control. She had thought Richard was something real. But in the end, Richard had vanished the moment the scandal broke. And Jake had won. She was the one left behind, haunted by everything she had lost, and no one was coming to save her.